They shoved her lesson plans to the floor and laughed when she picked them up. One even flicked a pencil at her head and said, "You're just a babysitter with a chalkboard." What they didn't realize? The woman they were mocking had spent a decade mastering the art of discipline, in and out of the dojo. When 27-year-old Erin Nakamura stepped into the chaos of Oak Ridge Reform School, she wasn't expecting order. The school was infamous for its revolving door of teachers, its hallway fights, and students who didn't just test limits, they erased them. It had been called the last stop before juvie by the local paper. For Erin, freshly hired and barely out of a grueling martial arts teaching sabbatical in Kyoto, this was meant to be a change of pace. What she found instead was a war zone in sneakers. On her first morning, the hallways buzzed like a pressure cooker on the verge of blowing. Kids slammed lockers, cursed at staff, and roamed like they owned the place. At the center of the storm, a senior named Dylan Chase, 6'3", cocky, and always surrounded by his loyal pair of sidekicks, Benji and Marco. They called themselves the Hall Kings, and teachers whispered their names the same way folks talk about tornado warnings, like disasters you can't avoid, only survive. Erin wore a neat charcoal blazer over a simple dark green blouse, her long black hair tied up in a clean bun. She didn't look intimidating. That's what made her dangerous. Principal Sharp, a thin, hollow-eyed woman who looked like she hadn't slept since 2012, greeted her at the gates with a nervous smile. "I'll be honest with you, Miss Nakamura," she said. "We've had 6 teachers walk out this semester alone. Just keep your head down and get through the day." But Erin hadn't come here to survive the day. She came to make a difference, even if it meant doing what none of her predecessors dared, holding the line. That morning, when she introduced herself in room C8, half the class ignored her. Dylan leaned back in his chair, earbuds in, smirking like he'd already won, and when she calmly asked for attention, Marco knocked her binder off the desk. The students laughed, but Erin didn't. She simply looked up, gathered her pages, and smiled, calmly, quietly, because what they didn't know yet was that the babysitter with a chalkboard had a black belt in control and the patience of someone who could snap bones without breaking a sweat. The faculty lounge smelled like burnt coffee and hopelessness. Erin stood by the window, watching 2 students shout at each other in the courtyard, while a security guard half-heartedly waved them apart. "You're still here?" muttered Mr. Lawson, a tired math teacher who looked twice his age. "Most subs quit after first period." Erin offered a polite nod but didn't explain herself. Let them think she was temporary. Let them underestimate her. It had always been an advantage. What the staff didn't know, and the students would soon find out, was that Erin Nakamura wasn't just another wide-eyed idealist with a clipboard and a nervous smile. She had trained under Master Okabe in a Kyoto basement gym so cold the mats used to crack. She had sparred blindfolded against multiple opponents, learned to break holds with one wrist bound, and mastered the art of psychological control. After being mugged on the subway in her teens, she had vowed to never feel powerless again. That promise had shaped her life and brought her here. Not because she wanted to fight, but because sometimes peace had to be enforced by those who understood violence. She wasn't looking for a challenge, but when it came, she never flinched. And challenge was exactly what Dylan and his crew brought to her classroom. Day 2, they changed the whiteboard to read, "Ms. No Clue." Day 3, they switched out her chair with one missing a wheel. Day 4, Benji spilled water on the floor and tried to trip her. And through it all, Erin didn't raise her voice. She took attendance, taught the lesson, and kept an eye on their patterns. She studied their timing, the way Dylan led but never struck first, how Marco waited to see if she'd react, and how Benji fed off the group like a hyena. They thought they were testing her limits. What they didn't realize was that Erin didn't have limits. They were giving her a blueprint. By the end of the first week, Erin had become the center of a quiet storm. Rumors swirled about how the new teacher didn't scare easy, which only made Dylan more determined to break her. His reputation thrived on control, on watching teachers stutter, squirm, and call security after just a few minutes of his games. But Aaron wasn't reacting, and that unnerved him. On Friday, he took things further. As she entered room C8, she found her desk upside down, the drawers dumped out, and a vulgar drawing of her on the whiteboard. The room erupted with laughter. Aaron simply walked over, erased the drawing, and righted the desk without a word. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was precision. That same afternoon, Principal Sharp called her in with a worried look. "They're targeting you," she said bluntly. "I've seen this pattern before. Dylan's testing how far he can push before you crack. Please understand, we can't afford a lawsuit if you retaliate." Aaron nodded, thanked her, and walked out. She wasn't here to retaliate. She was here to teach a lesson, one that couldn't be found in a textbook. Dylan thought he was playing a game, but Aaron had been through real conflict. This wasn't a classroom to her anymore. It was a dojo. And in the dojo, discipline always wins. The turning point came on a rainy Tuesday. The air was thick with tension even before the bell rang. Dylan strutted into the classroom 10 minutes late, soaked from the downpour, dripping water across the floor like a trail of arrogance. He didn't sit. Instead, he walked up to Aaron's desk, leaned on it, and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "You must really like being ignored, huh? Or are you just too stupid to quit like everyone else?" Laughter echoed around the room. Marco kicked the leg of her chair. Benji tossed a crumpled paper ball at her head. Still, Aaron remained seated, legs crossed, eyes calm. "Dylan," she said evenly, "you've had your fun. Now take your seat." That's when he grabbed her chair and pulled it back a few inches, forcing her to adjust or fall. Gasps rippled across the room. A teacher touched, on purpose, was a line even Dylan hadn't crossed before. "Or what?" he challenged, his voice taunting. "You gonna write me up, call my mom?" Aaron stood slowly, never breaking eye contact. "No," she said, "but I will show you what happens when you confuse kindness with weakness." Her voice was steady, but the undertones shifted. Something had changed. The class fell dead silent, not because they believed her, but because they felt it. Dylan stepped closer, expecting fear. What he saw was composure. What he didn't know was that Aaron's entire body had just shifted into stance. Her balance anchored, her breath steady. The countdown to his lesson had begun. For a heartbeat, everything froze. No one breathed, no one moved. Dylan's smirk wavered just slightly, but he didn't back off. He was used to teachers bluffing, not biting. Aaron kept her hands relaxed at her sides, but her posture had changed. Rooted like a tree, every inch of her alert. "Last chance," she said, her voice soft, but with a tone that silenced even the whispers in the back row. "Sit down." Dylan looked around. The class was watching, phones quietly angled from laps and sleeves. He saw Marco give him a grin that said, "Do it." And Benji, already filming. So Dylan shoved her desk. Not hard, just enough to slide it back and make a point. "You don't scare me, lady," he sneered. "You're just another teacher pretending to matter." That was it. Aaron stepped forward with a fluid motion so fast it barely registered before she was beside him, not in front of him. In one seamless movement, she intercepted the hand that had just shoved her desk and bent it backward into a joint lock. It was efficient, controlled, and precise, not aggressive. Dylan's body dropped to one knee, his voice caught between a grunt and a whimper. Phone shot up. What are you doing?" he yelped, trying to yank free, but her grip was immovable. "Pain compliance?" Aaron said calmly. "Pressure without injury, very common in law enforcement and legal when a student makes physical threats." Her tone wasn't angry. It was instructional, like she was explaining grammar rules. Dylan twisted again. Useless. The more he resisted, the more it hurt. "Let me go!" he barked, his voice cracking. "You're gonna get fired!" Aaron looked around the room, locking eyes with every student. "This is what happens when respect is replaced with arrogance. I've given fair warnings. I've endured humiliation. But now you've crossed a line." She gently released him, stepping back as Dylan scrambled to his feet, face red and eyes wide with disbelief. His followers were frozen. No one rushed to his side. Even Marco looked like he'd swallowed a stone. "If you ever lay a hand on me or anyone else in this room again," Aaron said, "you'll learn the full difference between strength and showmanship." No one laughed. Not even Benji. Every student stared at her like they were seeing her for the first time. Not as a teacher, but as something else entirely, something unshakable. And from that moment on, the class belonged to her. By the time the lunch bell rang that day, Erin Nakamura had become the most talked about name in Oak Ridge Reform School, not because of a viral meltdown, but because of what she didn't do. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't called security. She hadn't flinched. She had taken the school's top bully and shown, without hurting him, how control, technique, and calm could dismantle chaos in less than 10 seconds. Students whispered about it in hushed tones like they were describing a ghost sighting. Some didn't believe it, others had footage. But no one could deny that something in room C8 had changed. Dylan didn't return for the second half of the day. Neither did Marco or Benji. Rumor was they'd been sent home early, though no one saw them go through the front office. Principal Sharp found Erin in the hallway between classes. "Whatever happened in that room? I don't want to know," she said softly. "But I can tell you right now, I've never seen those boys walk out of a room that quietly." Erin simply nodded. She wasn't after praise. She was preparing. Because she knew what retaliation looked like, and silence wasn't surrender, it was strategy. She went about the rest of the day as usual, reviewing poetry, leading discussions, assigning journals, but she could feel it in the walls. Something was coming. Bullies didn't back down. They regrouped. And if Dylan's ego was as fragile as his bravado suggested, he'd need to reassert control fast. Erin had seen it before in tournaments, in alleyways, and once in a Tokyo bar fight. Men who couldn't accept being bested by a woman rarely stayed down. They came back louder, riskier, and more reckless. She replayed the classroom moment over and over that night, not out of doubt, but to sharpen her memory of his reaction, his grip, his stance. Every fighter had a rhythm, and Dylan Chase was about to lose his. Erin wasn't planning a fight, but she was preparing for one, because the real test hadn't happened yet. The confrontation came the very next morning, not in the classroom, but in the staff parking lot. Erin arrived early, just like always, sipping black coffee from a thermos and reviewing her lesson plan on conflict in literature. But the moment she stepped out of her car, she knew something was off. Dylan's black Dodge Charger was already parked at the far end, unusual for a student who could barely show up before second period. Then she saw Marco, leaning against a nearby light pole pretending to scroll through his phone. Benji was pacing near the dumpsters. They weren't here for school, they were waiting for her. Erin closed her car door and walked forward without changing pace. Her every instinct went on high alert, not out of fear, but readiness. Her fingers flexed slightly, her breath slowed, her senses sharpened like a blade. She wasn't just a teacher in that moment. She was a tactician walking into a pre-fight arena. Dylan stepped out from behind a row of shrubs, hoodie pulled over his head, a baseball bat slung casually over his shoulder. "We need to talk," he said, voice low. "Privately." Erin didn't break stride. "You don't need a bat for conversation," she replied calmly. Dylan's jaw tightened. "That stunt yesterday? You embarrassed me. Made me look weak. In front of everyone." Marco flanked her left. Benji started circling behind. "I tried to give you chances," Erin said. "In front of everyone. Now you're making the mistake of thinking silence means surrender." Dylan gestured with the bat. "I think you need to be reminded what happens when you push people too far." Erin stopped, looked him square in the eye, and dropped her bag gently on the ground. "You're right about one thing," she said. "Someone's about to learn what happens when you push too far. But it won't be me." She stepped into an open stance, balanced, grounded, centered. Years of training thrummed beneath her skin like a quiet drumbeat. The three boys exchanged glances. Marco cracked his knuckles. Benji spit into the dirt. Dylan tightened his grip on the bat. And just like that, the showdown began. Not with shouting, not with warnings, but with stillness so sharp it could slice through steel. Erin had spent her life preparing for moments exactly like this. And these boys were about to find out what it meant to challenge someone who only fights when there's no other choice left. The first move came from Marco, lunging from Erin's left with all the clumsy confidence of someone who thought brute force could outmatch precision. She sidestepped, fluid as water, and redirected his momentum with a simple wrist deflection that sent him tumbling into the side of a parked car. The metallic clang echoed across the lot, followed by his stunned grunt. Benji rushed next, throwing a wild punch meant more for intimidation than accuracy. Erin ducked beneath it, stepped inside, and delivered a sharp palm strike to his sternum. Not enough to break anything, but enough to drop him to his knees, gasping for air. 2 down. Dylan hesitated. He still held the bat, but the swagger had drained from his posture. His eyes flicked to Marco writhing on the ground, then to Benji coughing beside the curb. "You done?" Erin asked, her voice calm, her breath steady. "Or do you need the same lesson they just got?" He snarled, raised the bat and charged. It was messy, emotional, desperate. Erin waited until the last second, then pivoted, snatching his wrist and twisting it upward in a disarming motion that sent the bat clattering to the pavement. Dylan stumbled forward off balance, and in that moment, Erin slipped behind him and applied a rear chokehold, not to harm, but to restrain. "You think strength is noise," she whispered as he thrashed uselessly, "but real power is control." Dylan's legs buckled, his hands clawing at her arms. She tightened her grip just enough to make his limbs go slack, then released him before he lost consciousness. He collapsed onto the pavement, coughing, dazed, stunned. Erin stood over him, her body composed, not even a strand of hair out of place. Marco had staggered to his feet, but didn't advance. Benji was still on his knees. The silence that followed wasn't just shock, it was recognition. The kind that rewrites a narrative. Dylan, who had never lost, had just been dismantled by someone who never raised her voice. Erin knelt beside him and said only one thing. "You brought this to my doorstep. Next time, choose better." Then she stood, picked up her bag, and walked into the building, leaving 3 boys behind in a parking lot littered with their arrogance. By third period, the story had spread through the school like a wildfire in dry grass. No one knew all the details, but whispers passed fast. Dylan got wrecked. She dropped Marco without even trying. Benji cried. Every student had a different version. But one thing was clear. Erin Nakamura was no longer the new teacher. She was something else entirely. In room C8, the energy was different. Students walked in quietly, even the loud ones. Phones were away. Eyes were forward. Dylan wasn't in his seat, neither was Marco or Benji. But the space they left behind felt more than just empty. It felt reclaimed. Erin started her lesson like nothing had happened, calmly reviewing metaphors and character arcs. And for the first time, the class listened. Not out of fear, but out of a deep, collective respect that had taken root overnight. The students weren't just curious, they were ready. Erin had proven that discipline wasn't about domination. It was about standing firm when the easy choice is backing down. Even Principal Sharp popped her head in halfway through class and simply mouthed, "Thank you," before walking away. Later that day, Dylan returned, not with swagger, but with silence. He took his seat in the middle row, opened his notebook, and didn't say a word. No challenges, no comments, just quiet focus. And when class ended, he lingered by the door, waiting until the last student left. "I was wrong," he muttered, not quite looking her in the eye. "About you, about everything." Erin gave a slight nod. "Correction is part of learning." Dylan nodded once and walked away, not defeated, but different. Erin watched him go, knowing that real change doesn't happen with one fight. It happens in the moments after, when people choose to be better. And for the first time since arriving at Oak Ridge, she believed that was possible, even here. By the end of the week, room C8 had become the safest, most focused classroom in the entire school. Word of what happened in the parking lot never made it to official reports, but the effect was impossible to ignore. Students who had once disrupted class now raised their hands. Kids who had stayed silent out of fear began to speak up. Even faculty whispered about Erin Nakamura with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. One teacher joked, "She didn't just flip the script, she rewrote the whole play." Dylan, Marco, and Benji returned each day without fanfare. No more threats, no more smirks. Dylan even stayed after class one afternoon to help stack chairs. There was no apology, just a quiet act of service that spoke volumes. Erin never bragged. She never reminded anyone of what she'd done. She simply taught. With clarity, with strength, with the kind of presence that didn't demand respect, but earned it. And as Oak Ridge Reform School slowly began to shift, people realized the change hadn't started with new policies or outside programs. It started with one teacher who refused to be intimidated. One woman who knew that the greatest power wasn't in fists or fear, but an unshakable discipline and the courage to act when it mattered most. Erin Nakamura had come to Oak Ridge to teach English. What she delivered was a lesson in character. And in the halls once ruled by noise, a new kind of silence had taken root, the kind that follows when strength speaks softly and is finally heard.